Welcome to Beyond the Wheeze, the podcast where real stories meet expert insight on asthma and other chronic respiratory conditions. I'm your host, Josh Rayon, asthma advocate and patient voice. Each week, we explore the challenges, progress, and possibilities shaping respiratory care. Through conversations with patients, clinicians, and changemakers, we shine a light on what it means to live and breathe better. This is Beyond the Wheeze. Today, I'm joined by Eric Kloss, founder and CEO of Daily Breath. Eric's work focuses on the relationship between outdoor air quality, environmental exposure, and respiratory health, particularly asthma. He has spent years studying how factors like air pollution, pollen, wildfire smoke, and weather patterns influence breathing, often before symptoms or attacks occur. Daily Breath was built to address a major gap in asthma care, the lack of personalized, real-time insight into environmental risk outdoors, where many asthma triggers originate. Rather than reacting after an exacerbation, Eric's work centers on anticipating risk, helping people understand when outdoor conditions may increase the likelihood of breathing problems. At its core, his mission is about prevention, reducing avoidable asthma attacks by making outdoor environmental risk visible, understandable, and actionable. With all that being said, Eric, welcome to Beyond the Wheeze. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Josh. It's a pleasure to be on Beyond the Wheeze, and I do commend you on your podcast and your work within the asthma community, and I really greatly appreciate the opportunity to share my vision for Daily Breath.
So I'm going to start with the moment that sparked Daily Breath. Eric, Daily Breath didn't start as a generic health tech idea. It started really with a realization about how environmental conditions affect chronic illness. Can you walk us through the moment that made this work feel super urgent to you?
I think the urgency came a little bit later, but the kind of the light bulb moment that I've described to people is that my sister has rheumatoid arthritis, and she was living with my family at the time, and she came downstairs one morning with kind of, the fixed fingers, kind of a rheumatoid arthritis flare up. And she kind of casually said to me, it'd be interesting if there was a mobile app that would tell me when the weather conditions are changing, and that's impacting my RA flaring up, right? And those can be things like precipitation changes, barometric pressure changes, a couple of different variables that are weather related. But for me, it kind of struck as, the idea was, well, what are environmental conditions that impact health? That was really the intersection. It's like these conditions are going on, whether it's weather related or whether it's environmental related, and they impact health. And I didn't really see within, kind of the medical community that was something that was really well addressed. And so that's what started the journey of exploring. I have a voracious appetite for learning. And so, that's when I started to dive into, well, what are, some of the principal conditions that are impacted by environmental health?
You've said that asthma became a central focus because the connection between outdoor air and symptoms is so direct. What did you see in asthma care that made you feel something critical was missing?
Right. Well, so in that particular case, I started to explore 4 different areas. 2 of them are arthritis and joint pain, and migraines and headaches, which, there are definitely weather and environmental variables that impact those particular conditions. But those are not conditions that have what I call incidental impacts. And what I mean by that is something occurs, an acute symptom occurs that leads to a negative outcome that impacts the health system, right? You get rushed to the ER, or you have a long-term hospital stay, or you have a cardiac event. There's various things. So that really honed me in on cardiovascular health and respiratory health. And then when you looked at respiratory health, you obviously begin to get into allergens and pollutants and how those impact people who have asthma and COPD. And those are the areas where you begin to realize, okay, this is where ER visits are occurring. These are where long-term inpatient hospital stays are occurring. 10 people die in the United States every day due to an asthma attack. And again, I describe these as potentially preventable asthma attacks, right? And so that's really the heartache. There was a story shortly before I launched in 2018, my first prototype, my first MVP of the product, about a young woman in Iowa. Diamond Conway was her name, and she was going on a family vacation in Nebraska. She was from Nebraska, going to Iowa, one of the two. I can't remember, but and she went to an amusement park outside, and Iowa, could have been pesticides in the air, lots of pollution. Nowadays, it might even be wildfire smoke. But she ultimately came back to a hotel and ended up going to a pool, and pool has chlorine. And the chlorine ultimately became the final trigger, right, in causing her to have an asthma attack. And then she, unfortunately, was rushed to the ER, and was down for about 20 minutes, and she ended up being a paraplegic. And so this really just struck me as kind of evidence of how traumatic the impact was of an environmental set of variables. Okay, whether it was chlorine as the final trigger or not, there is an issue of people have triggers that are impacting them all day long. And so there's something called symptom march in asthma, which is about you having these constant triggers that are impacting you. And slowly that marches you towards having acute symptoms that require you to use a rescue or relief inhaler. Otherwise, you're going to be going to the ER and potentially staying at the hospital to recover your breathing.
When you first looked at how asthma triggers are discussed in healthcare, what stood out to you as incomplete or overlooked?
Right. So that's what struck me is when I looked at it, I felt that there is a perception among the medical community that patients are at the mercy of the weather and the environment, right? And so they didn't seem to focus on a lot. They really neglected environmental health, in part because they didn't understand the correlations between environmental conditions and patient daily health. How are they being impacted daily? It's only been in recent years where we've begun to understand the symptom march. So I think that it kind of lacked an appreciation also of the personal nature of exposure impact. We talk a lot about air quality in public health terms, more about, kind of here's the broadcast information around air quality for your entire community, but we don't talk about personal exposure impact, right? And so I thought that was where we really lacked some information. And that's where I felt we needed to start to, I felt that exposure impact is as personal as your genetics, right? How you react to pollutants and allergens is very personal. And we're not tracking that. We're tracking it as a broadcast or distributed model of you look passively at information about air quality. And that doesn't drive you taking action, you changing behavior, you buying an air purifier, any of those things that might mitigate a pollutant exposure that causes an asthma attack.
When people think about asthma triggers outdoors, they often think of pollen alone. From your work, Eric, what other outdoor factors have the biggest impact on respiratory patients? And I know wildfire smoke is probably going to be top of that list.
Absolutely. And I think this is where there's been just a lot of growth in the market over the last 10 years that I've been exploring this. And I think that part of that's because of COVID, right? COVID kind of highlighted what are these indoor things that are going on with the air and how are they impacting people's health, right? So certainly wildfire smoke is absolutely one. This is where, I ultimately pivoted away from allergies and asthma alone to kind of the broader perspective of health, in part because of what we were finding out about wildfire smoke, right? We were finding wildfire smoke had a direct impact on cardiovascular health, right? Because those large those small PM 2.5 particulates are being inhaled into your lungs, but also going straight into your bloodstream and potentially coagulating your blood, right? Potentially causing maybe a stroke or a heart attack event, right? So that's one impact. Another thing that they've learned is that pregnant women who are exposed to wildfire smoke particulates, they are actually exposing their babies in utero to particulates, So they're learning these things. And then the other acute exposure that's really, really grown in the last year or so is mold. And we're just really on the leading edge right now of suddenly focusing on mold exposure, understanding that mold spores are in your home all the time. Okay. If you don't maintain a particular humidity level, which is about 40 to 60% humidity level in your home, um, uh, below 40 is too dry. Above 40, above 60 is too wet, right? So above 60, you're going to start developing mold if you have humidity levels that are very high. They're basically, it's not just water damage from rains and stuff like that, with your roof, but it's also just these particular types of humidity levels that could be creating mold spores in your home. And that's just a big issue because, again, where are a lot of people experiencing asthma attacks? Certainly people experience asthma attacks outdoors, but many of them experience asthma attacks indoors. And so, beginning to understand what that looks like. And again, we'll get into this a little bit more, but there's not many ways of tracking mold spores, right? Measuring mold spores, right? Identifying mold spores because they're a different type of mold, right? When you talked about pollen allergens, the real deficit in understanding allergies from a patient perspective is most people are allergic to specific allergens. You may define yourself as being allergic to trees, weeds, or grasses, but more often than not, people are allergic to a specific type of tree, right? It's not just a tree. And so there's tests that can be done that will show you what type of tree you're allergic to. And in a perfect world, we'd be able to get the measurement data and the identification data around what pollen spores are in your area. So we actually would know whether you're allergic to it. You've probably heard times when people who have allergies go to a different area of the country, right? And they may not be allergic where they are, but they go to this other part of the country and they have allergies, right? And it's because they're allergic to a specific allergen. So these are some of the dynamics that are kind of occurring for people out there. And we just haven't done enough research and progress around measurement and identification to empower patients really to respond.
So we've talked about asthma in the household. We've talked about wildfire smoke a little bit and traveling, but weather plays a role as well. And how do changes in temperature, humidity, and atmospheric conditions influence breathing and asthma control?
Right. Well, so I think that this was where I was intrigued because hot temperatures and high humidity. Well, why are people having more asthma attacks on those types of days, right? And so what you begin to realize is that pollutants and allergens are particulates. And when you have hot temperatures and high humidity, those particulates adhere to each other. Okay. So the density is what ultimately gets inhaled in a more abundance, right? So pollen spores are more dense and then they're more easily inhaled. Pollen spores also vary in size. So like sometimes you'll hear about thunderstorm asthma. There's been a couple of incidences down in Australia where they've had thunderstorm asthma and a large number of people just are rushed to the ER. And part of it is because they have ryegrass in Australia, and ryegrass is very, very small. They have hot temperatures and high humidity that coalesces all of these pollen spores together. And then they have the windborne activity going on with thunderstorms and all that stuff. And then there's some dynamic which they're just discovering, which is the thunderstorm, the electricity in the thunderstorm. It causes even more challenges because it breaks the pollen spores and breaks them down so they're even more easily inhalable, right? And that's what leads to these massive amounts of asthma attacks. So weather in the context of temperature, humidity, and winds are extremely impactful on people having acute symptoms.
So now I am scared of lightning for a whole other reason. Thank you, Eric. One of the most important ideas in your work is cumulative exposure. Can you explain why repeated exposure to poor outdoor air matters more than just a single bad air day?
Well, so again, this is where I think the evidence is really emerging, and it's part of the thing that, I need to adjust the app to a certain extent because I was focused on acute symptoms. It's like record your symptom, right? But really, what we need to try to track is how did you feel today? Because what we're learning is, and just tracking overall, what are they exposed to on a particular day? Because what we want to be able to do is 6 months out, if somebody starts to develop a disease, right? Be able to point back to their environmental record and be able to go, okay, well, wait a second. Maybe the environment was impactful in developing this particular disease, right? Because what we're learning is there is a cumulative impact and in something even as such as behavioral health. I mean, you know, are you feeling, more and more down or less, because you've been exposed to pollutants and allergens and stuff like that? There's a certain amount of wear and tear from a physiological perspective, most likely. But the question is do the actual exposures themselves cause that type of deterioration? So really understanding the impact on health, right? How is it impacting longevity? Long-term exposure to particular pollutants, is that impacting, the physiologically something that's going on in our body that has impacts downstream, right? And so that is kind of an area where we have an opportunity for growth. And again, it's kind of where when I pivoted to the air you breathe in your health, it was with the intent of beginning to document not just acute symptoms when people are feeling like they are starting to experiencing breathing difficulty or something like that, but also kind of just tracking their overall wellness on a daily basis, and beginning to understand what are the cumulative impacts.
How does long-term exposure to outdoor air pollution shape asthma control, lung resilience, and overall respiratory health?
Right. So my premise here is that we lack a couple of things. Environmental awareness, right? So we need to understand, I would say at a very local level, what is going on with the air I breathe. I breathe, okay? It's not a 5 kilometer 3.1 model data algorithm that gives us air quality indexes, okay? And that's what we have today, okay? Most air quality indexes are providing a measurement for a 5 mile area, a 5 kilometer area, 3.1 miles. Okay. You're right here. Okay. You're breathing something right here, not 3.1 miles away. Right. So we need really granular local data. So that's number one is environmental awareness. Number two is the intelligence. The intelligence is how does my body respond in relation to the pollutants I'm being exposed to? That's number two. And number three, I know how I'm being impacted by these exposures. I want to take action to protect my health. How do I protect my health from pollutants outside or inside, right? Well, I can change my behaviors, okay? Maybe it was one of the features I'm beginning to build on is an ability to take that air quality heat map and say, I want to go to this location, this park over across town, right? And I type in that location and I say, is it in a healthy zone or not? Right. And immediately it can tell me, oh, it's in a healthy zone. I'm going to do that with a new data partner that's doing mobility-based data, that's getting data in a city down to 20-meter data because they're measuring on top of a vehicle air quality, and that vehicle's going throughout the city all the time. And they have maybe 50 of these cars that are equipped with these types of sensors. So you're getting more granular data that allows people to look at that information and go, okay, well, I wanted to go to that park. What's the best route to go to that park? Is it in a healthy zone or not? All of these different things that actually allow you to change your behavior, right? The other thing that it does is if you know on certain times of the day that it's a bad day, maybe you do wear a mask. Maybe there's a personal air purifier device like Respiratory that you could use if you're going to that location. I mean, obviously, the perception is that, well, I can't stop going outside. Well, yeah, I get that, right? But you can take action, right? If you know you're going to a location that has particular threats, don't you want to protect your health from those threats, right? So these are the types of things that you can do proactively to prevent asthma exacerbations, to prevent COPD exacerbations. And then, I think part of that is, knowing, part of the thing is trying to support good management of your asthma condition or your COPD condition by having automatic medication reminders, tracking medication adherence, providing educational videos about how to use a rescue inhaler. Between you and me, I think one of the things that people don't understand or appreciate is the reason there are so many ER visits associated with asthma is because many people who depend on either a controller inhaler or a rescue inhaler, okay, to administer emergency assistance in breathing, they don't know how to use their inhaler properly. They don't know how to use it properly. So people often wonder, well, why does that lead to an ER visit? It's because they're basically trying to pump this medication deep into their lungs to open up their airways and breathe properly to recover their breathing. Okay. If they're not doing it properly, they're not getting enough medication back into the back of the lungs. They'll pump 4, 5, 6, 7 times. If they're not doing it right, it doesn't matter. They're on a march towards having respiratory difficulty. And if you don't breathe for 3 minutes, there are serious problems. Okay. So within 3 minutes, you're making a determination of, I need emergency assistance. Okay. You're going to ER. Okay. And that's how important this is. That, it's like, these are incidences that if you ask patients, they want to prevent. If you ask parents of children, they want to prevent, right? And what we have is a culture that has said, okay, here's your rescue inhaler. And it's only now that we've realized that the rescue inhaler is kind of like the AED, a defibrillator, right? For the heart, right? And now we're starting to talk about rescue inhalers in schools. It's like, years ago, if someone gave another child a rescue inhaler in school, that was not allowed. That was not allowed. And yet now, finally, they're putting these types of rescue inhalers in schools so that if a child has a problem, they have a rescue inhaler. Okay. And these are kinds of things that, have been required because we don't focus as much on the preventative health part of it, which I'm trying to do.
I know a clinician or two that would agree with you as well that improper use of inhalers is absolutely something that's going to put you in the hospital or can put you in the hospital, or is one of the main reasons why you would go to the emergency room with asthma. It seems so simple, but it's complicated, or it can be complicated if you don't know what you're doing. And I can attest to that. I did not learn how to properly use my inhaler until I was in college, and that was from a YouTube video. Like I said, I've had asthma since I was born. I've had asthma my entire life. I spent months in the hospital as a kid, and I did not know how to use an inhaler properly. Oftentimes, it's the smallest things. Earlier, you had spoke about the heat maps in this app and how it would tell you what is considered a healthy zone or maybe a zone that you should stay away from. Now, from my understanding, is that personalized to you?
Yes. I mean, the goal would be over time. And I think one of the challenges will be to figure out what threshold of evidence is necessary from an algorithm perspective, right? To generate either a personalized risk index which is what I ultimately want to do. I want to be able to gather all your symptom information and say, okay, based on this, you have a personalized risk index that I can measure. I call it the Perry score, right? Personalized environmental health risk index. And what that will mean is it has 2 things calculated. One is it can say, okay, based on knowing the different variables that have come in, you're a 5 because nitrogen dioxide is one of your biggest triggers, and that's high today, right? It also then could also, if we wanted to, have a separate alert related to nitrogen dioxide. Okay. But that's a personalized risk index. The whole purpose then also of tracking your symptoms is to incorporate, like, where am I experiencing symptoms, right? So if I am saying this is a healthy zone, then certainly that's a place I haven't had symptoms, right? So it's correlating symptoms and the environmental conditions, right? So when I talk about heat maps and trying to figure out what healthy zones are, I want the healthy zone to reflect not just what the exposure, there's a severity of the exposure, but actually what your experience has been at that location, right? Because it could be that, like, this location always is a yellow on the map, right? But I've had two symptoms there. So it may be yellow, but something's going on there that's causing me to have symptoms. Now, most likely what the app has probably told you is your symptoms are nitrogen dioxide. And even though it's yellow for air quality index, right? And this is where I think we also have to get into the elements of tracking individual pollutants, right? You just can't rely on an air quality index, which is just a number that indicates the collective severity of air quality among all of these pollutants, right? It'd be a lot better if it was actually towards a specific pollutant, so you can then make those decisions based on that. And that's where that personal component comes in.
For clinicians and caregivers, why is it important to think about environmental exposure as a pattern, not just a one-off trigger?
Yeah, well, and again, that's the key here is how do you change behaviors if you don't know what your behavior patterns are, right? And so what we're trying to do in some ways is show people at an individual and personal level, here's the things that you do during your day. Here's how you're being exposed to exposures. And here is your health impact as reflected in symptoms or in wellness impact, right? And that's what we're trying to do, is really provide people an understanding of their own personal patterns in relation to the environmental conditions that they have outside or indoors, hopefully eventually too. And then, based on that, be able to take some type of action, right? Like I said, behavior change, actions to protect your health, whatever those types of things are.
As we've been discussing, Eric, a major part of Daily Breath is helping people recognize environmental risk before an asthma flare. Why is early awareness such a powerful tool for prevention?
So one of the keys here too is trying to recognize early onset symptoms, right? I mean, we don't want people to have to experience an acute symptom, right? An acute exacerbation, right? What we're trying to do is prevent them from actually having a symptom march, right? In some ways, people who have asthma and COPD, there's an expectation that it's a foregone conclusion that they have airway inflammation, and that airway inflammation is a baseline. And then it's built on these various triggers that you're exposed to as you go through your day, right? And I think that's risky to understand to a certain extent, because I think the issue is do they need to have a level of inflammation, right? We don't really know, even just generally, like, what are we exposed in the indoor air, right? That potentially is already inhibiting respiratory capacity, right? And so I think that's part of the problem, is just recognizing that we've treated environmental conditions as in a passive manner, and they may be acting on us in a way that's already inhibiting our health. And certainly for people who have asthma and COPD, I think that's the case. One of the things I've been talking to folks about recently is, as I kind of talk about protecting your health, is listen, protect your health in your bedroom and your living room. Okay. And let me talk to you about the bedroom. Okay. When do most people have asthma attacks? Ironically, it's early in the morning. Okay. Now, why is that? Well, in many cases, you're sleeping, okay, and you're breathing potential pollutants and allergens in your bedroom, right? And so here's a breathing activity. Your rhythm lowers, right? And you're breathing less, but now you're breathing poor air, right? And so what it starts to do is build this airway inflammation that ultimately leads early in the morning to a trigger, right? So the symptom march is occurring as you go through the night, right? And then it leads to a trigger, in the morning that you might be exposed to. So, you know, for me, I think part of it is empowering people to understand where pollutants and allergens impact their lives and what are the tools that can help them start a baseline. I was talking to somebody recently about promoting um, uh, nasal rinse, a nasal rinse. I don't know if you've seen products out there. You can just do a nasal rinse in the morning.
Mhm.
I mean, it makes total sense if you have respiratory difficulty, if you have allergies, right? What this does is clean your nostrils of particulates that are already stuck in there, right? So imagine, it's kind of like brushing your teeth, right? I mean, you're brushing your teeth to protect your teeth, but we never really think of nasal rinses to protect our nose, right? How do I breathe without having all of these particulates already captured in my nose hairs, right? And so that's this thing, is just about nasal rinsing. Again, I don't want to get into too much detail here, but again, it's just there are certain things that we it's just been an oversight. I think, environmental triggers are somewhat of an oversight in our in our daily health, right? And I just think, again, I read an article. I think Thermo Fisher Scientific did it because they were kind of um, they were trying to promote, allergy identification, which is like you can get a blood test. They have a blood test called Immunocap, and they can do a blood test, and it'll tell you specifically what your allergens are. And it's been around for years, right? So you can actually know exactly what your allergens are. But they were promoting it, and what they said, they did a huge analysis, and they said really acute exacerbations and the number of ER visits and then the associated number of inpatient hospital stays is really a health system failure. It's a failure on the part of the health system to recognize environmental triggers that are impacting our health. And I think that, at times the frustration for me in the last several years has been the climate alarmism. Okay. And it's like, yes, I get the climate alarmism and I get that people want to advocate for policies and regulation around climate change, but that doesn't stop what's going on today and what's going on tomorrow. And so how is our health system going to respond to that? And that's where I see just significant gaps. I mean, it is encouraging, I think, in isolated places. You see pediatricians, you see allergy and asthma specialists, you see cardiovascular doctors, beginning to see those correlations and beginning to figure out, okay, well, how does that get woven into the fabric of healthcare, right? And so that's one of the envelopes that we're trying to push, with Daily Breath, as well as some other partnerships that we're working on. Because again, we should be, pay, for the health system, health payers, the government, Medicaid, these types of products like an air purifier should be paid by the government, paid by your health payer, right? I mean, reality is these tools are tools that improve your health, right? They mitigate negative health outcomes, and we should be trying to reduce those. So spending money on an air purifier from your HSA account or something like that, all of those types of things are things that the government really should be endorsing, or health payers should be endorsing, to promote those types of activities. Because, again, the money spent in preventative is ultimately saving a huge amount of money in acute care expenses.
For clinicians listening, how can environmental data help explain symptoms that feel unpredictable or hard to control?
Well, so we're working on a couple of concepts, and I think it's going to take time. I mean, healthcare is a very challenging technology environment, and right now we're talking to pediatricians who have an electronic health record, right? So, in order to manage their patients, they have an electronic health record. Let's say it's Epic or Allscripts or anything like that, right? And what we're talking to them about is they're starting to include apps within their environment, right? And so what we're talking to them about is on that patient record, is there a way of identifying environmental conditions, drawing in data into that record that says, here are the environmental conditions at that child's home and at that child's school, right? And when those, again, if you combine it with daily breath, right? We've got the user using daily breath and they're starting to track their personalized impacts, right? And suddenly now we're able to potentially recognize that a particular pollutant impacts triggers. And so then now we've given that alert capability to the doctor. So the doctor has something that's flagged in the record that says, oh, okay, I need to reach out to this family, the family caregiver, identifying that there's a problem. And that could be an alert in form of a text. It could be an email or something that just says, hey, pollutants are bad in your area. Don't forget your rescue inhaler when you go to school or to the playground or wherever. I mean, it's about, again, helping the patient change their behavior, adjust their behavior, protect their health, take those actions. So we're in the early stages of having those conversations. But I do think, again, I don't want to be a doomsayer, but I sometimes tell people, you have to operate from a perspective of it's going to get worse before it gets better. And so I think we need to start now figuring out the models for how the medical community and the patient manages more effectively their environmental triggers. And I think that's the fundamental thing that has to change over the next several years. And it's very easy when you see in New Delhi how bad pollution is for it to be an issue there. But the fact of the matter is it's an invisible threat, right? And it's visible there. So everybody thinks, oh my God, it's horrible. It's horrible. But, the fact of the matter is most of our clean air initiative in the 1970s was about making the smokestack smoke cleaner. So you could see it. It wasn't really about removing a lot of the pollutants. Now it did some of that. But at the end of the day, it really was about cleaner air. We didn't want to see the smoke. So we put scrubbers, on these industrial plants and all these other kinds of things. So, but ultimately it's this invisible threat that we need to begin to quantify, identify, empower patients and just people broadly to be aware, intelligent about their personal impacts, and then take action.
And for innovators and researchers, what's missing from how outdoor air quality is currently communicated to people living with asthma?
Yeah, that's a big question. Last year, there's been a lot of good movement. There's an initiative called Go AQS to develop standards for air quality around the world because we have different air quality indices in different countries. And so there's a movement to do that. And then the other initiative that started last year was an air quality communications network. And so that's a worldwide organization that's really kind of beginning to work on how do we communicate these messages to individuals. I think the challenge there again, is that we need to understand how and why we're communicating air quality information to people, okay? If we're communicating it because it's a dialogue around pollution being bad and we need policy and regulation to manage pollution, that's a different communication than air quality is bad, it impacts your health, but you can do something about it to mitigate the impact to you personally, okay? Because again, I don't, you know, people can pursue policies and regulation, that's fine, but it's a much longer term horizon for progress. And in the meantime, you are still going to experience negative impacts to your health because of the pollutants and allergens that you breathe. So the issue becomes, how are you going to react personally? And that's the biggest challenge with air quality communication, is communicating to the medical community and to patients individually that environmental triggers are are causal to your symptoms, to your acute symptoms, but that you, in addition to your medical regimen that your doctor prescribes, can take action to mitigate even symptoms. Because quite frankly, I think the larger question I have when I think about serious pollution getting worse in the next several years is, if even if you're on a controller medication, are there scenarios under which you're still going to have an acute asthma exacerbation, even though you're taking your controller medication? A, either because the pollutant is worse, or B, because you've developed a tolerance to that particular controller medication and it doesn't have the same desired effect in mitigating an attack.
I would like to add in a standard disclaimer. For those listening, this is not medical advice. This conversation is for education and awareness only. It does not replace medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Anyone living with asthma or other respiratory condition should follow guidance from their healthcare provider and use the information discussed here as a complement, not a substitute for professional medical care. I'd like to move on now, Eric, to practical outdoor-focused takeaways, and let's talk about prevention a little bit. What are realistic ways people with asthma can reduce outdoor exposure risk without avoiding life altogether?
Right. So this is where we get into, once you have a set of behavior patterns, right? And so understanding kind of how environmental exposures impact you personally, when you're walking, walking to school, exercising, playing in the nearby park, commuting to work, right? All of these different types of things. If you understand that, then can we ultimately provide you better routes to take for those things? That's one particular way of adjusting your behavior to reduce your exposure to pollutants or allergens, right? That's one example. The other thing is, okay, so you have to go to those locations. Is this a time you wear a mask? Is this time you take a respirator with you? There's various things that I think people need to know. You have to have your rescue inhaler when you're going to this park, right? I mean, there's all these different things that are factored into these conditions that are impacted by environmental triggers. And what we're trying to do is really, provide them that takeaway from the app information and translate that into, okay, maybe I take this step or take this action. Because ultimately it's about trying to prevent the asthma attack that is just, a surprise, right? It's a surprise. And whether that's outside what treatment they're doing. And it's also, it's not understood. Why is it a surprise, right? It's a surprise because guess what? This pollutant is bad in that area, or this allergen is bad in that area. So, I mean, I just think that's what we're trying to do. And, it's like the fear, uncertainty, and doubt, right? How do you reduce FUD? And part of it is you need to be empowered by having the tools, that provide you an awareness and a personal understanding that allows you to take action.
I couldn't agree more. And for parents and caregivers, what should guide decisions about outdoor play, sports, and activities when air quality is variable?
Well, again, I think that the goal of Daily Breath is to tell you when pollutants and allergens are problematic for you. And so what that does is that gives you a what pollutants are problematic for you, a where pollutants are problematic for you, and a when. Okay. Now, for individual sports, those three elements are helpful, right? Okay, because the reality is, I wanted to go play tennis over here, at the club, right? Well, what's the condition of pollutants in that area at the club, right? Um, with the timing issue, right? If you suddenly are learning there's certain times of the day where the pollutants are worse in a particular area, maybe you don't go there at that time. Maybe you play tennis in the morning, right? So there's various things that I think that you can empower parents as well as children, as well as adults with asthma and COPD, with information that tells them the when, where, and what. What's going on? How do I adjust my behavior so that I'm not impacted by potential pollutants and allergens? And that's really the purpose of the app, is just to provide you enough information to adjust your behavior.
As we near the end of the podcast, I'd like to talk about reframing asthma care around environment. If outdoor environmental risk were treated as essential clinical context, how might asthma care change?
Well, I think this goes back to my pediatric asthma as kind of an example. I mean, what I was writing down here is, imagine a patient's child electronic health record includes environmental risk information for their home and school location, and personal alerts were triggered from the EHR to the patient when allergens or pollutant thresholds unique to the patient were present at that location. Linking the symptom tracker within Daily Breath, the pediatrician could begin to see the environmental context that the patient is experiencing symptoms. So not only are they proactively able to make alerts, but they're also being able to look at some trend lines that are actually showing them when this person is experiencing symptoms. It ultimately, if you're tracking medication adherence, you're also able to see when they're having symptoms associated with their medication intake. Okay, so that becomes a powerful component as well. And again, right now we don't vary between indoors and outdoors yet. The app will improve. We're going to include, the option of, was your symptom experienced indoors or was it experienced outdoors? We're going to start looking at, can you Bluetooth to an indoor air quality monitor so that you're able to pull data from the indoor air quality monitor when the user is actually indoors versus the data that's outside, right? When the user is outdoors, right? Now that's way off in the future, but that's ultimately what you'd want to do, right? Recognizing that outdoor air is unique and specific, but it does have an impact on indoor air, but indoor air is dealing with a whole slew of other things, right? Not just the outdoor air, but also what's indoors, with various VOCs and things like that. So, I think that we've got a long way to go, as I indicated, environmental data. We need to make improvements in the local, our ability to locally capture what's going on with environmental conditions. And then we also have to really make advances in figuring out, what's the best way that we can track this for the benefit of the patient and for the benefit of the system, right? I mean, that's what we're really looking to do. And we really need the allergy and asthma specialists. We need the pediatricians. That's why some of these discussions about research and stuff like that, I think the evidence is there. I mean, we don't need any more studies to ask whether environmental pollution is causing impacts on health. We understand that. The question is can we create models with researchers and with doctors specifically to kind of go through a full value chain that says, yes, environmental factors are impacting health. We can track those. We can actually track them at a personal level, and then we can translate that into individual action that prevents bad outcomes.
And looking ahead, what gives you hope about how environmental awareness could improve respiratory outcomes for people with asthma or COPD?
Well, I think, again, the hope is that the topic is top of mind. It's becoming top of mind in culture. And whether that's because of wildfire smoke being more evident both in the United States and around the world. Whether people are just more cognitive of a lot of extreme weather events causing, more, hurricanes, more precipitation events. All these things lead to mold, right? I mean, so there's a whole range of things that are heightening awareness, and that's the first step. And then within the broad research world, really where we have to make a lot of progress is in sensor measurement, right? And sensor development, right? And what we're trying to figure out is how do we create low form factor sensors that are, cheap, right? That can track air quality indoors and potentially outdoors as well, right? And we're trying to figure out how does that become as granular or local as possible. I'm looking at partnerships with Atmo 2 Pro, which is a wearable air quality monitor, right on the person, right? Now that's great. It tells you the measurement of PM 2.5 particulates. But in a perfect world, what we want to do is we want to both measure and identify a particulate, right? We lump pollen spores, mold spores, wildfire smoke particulates all into this bucket called PM 2.5, right? But in a perfect world, we'd be able to identify exactly what is the mold spore, what is the pollen spore, what is the specific pollutant, right? And so those are things that we want to progress in. And we are making progress. Again, if you look at what I've done in the last, 7, 8 years with Daily Breath, we did not have the robust data available that we have today at even the 5 kilometer level, right? Companies like Brazometer, Ambi, all these various companies have come out and, basically collected a lot of sensor data, sensor network data from around the world. We did not have companies like Sparrow Analytics with the mobility play where they're mapping an entire city with cars. We did not have the Atmo 2 Pro 2s with wearable air quality monitors. So, there's progress being made, but I think the challenge right now is we want to continue that progress, but we really want to figure out the full value chain for delivering, the full life cycle of value that we can for the topic, so that it actually translates into, improved outcomes, right? I mean, I think you won't really move the needle with the medical community until you can really kind of have almost a clinical trial validation, right? It's not that stringent, but you have to have enough validation of, hey, if you provide an environmental awareness on a personal level to an individual, they're more empowered to take action, and those actions actually prevent ER visits. So if a person had 5 ER visits last year and they weren't using Daily Breath, can I get down to 2, ER visits or 1 ER visits? If you can do that, that's when the medical community, I think, would respond and go, okay, now you've shown me that environmental awareness, intelligence, and action can actually help my patient. And therefore, I'm willing to pay for that data to be incorporated into my EHR or whatever those scenarios are.
Just like to say thank you, Eric, for coming on and sharing your knowledge and expertise with the listeners. Before we wrap up, Eric, where can listeners go to learn a little bit more about your work? And is there anything additional you would like to plug?
Sure. So the website is www.dailybreath.com. From that, you'll be able to find a lot of the thought leadership that I've promulgated over the years. The app is available on the App Store for iOS, and then also via Google Play for Android. And I encourage you to download. The app is free to download. Currently, we have a 99-cent version. We're going to make that particular version fully free shortly, and then we are building a premium version that's going to be called Daily Breath Personal, and that's going to have a lot of the personal components, your My Symptom map, your My Symptom table, and just we're going to begin to lay heat maps of specific pollutants over your symptoms. So as you experience symptoms, you'll actually be able to see those symptoms with specific pollutants overlaid. as impactful pollutants. But that's the biggest thing, and really the reason we're encouraging people to download the app is really to provide us feedback. And we need more people to provide us input into how do you want to consume information about the environment. That's the largest question right now. Most people go to a weather channel, app or something like that, and they see the air quality readings of severity. And the question is, how do you respond to that? And then, how would you potentially respond to a daily breath that's maybe tracking it on a personal level, personal to you, not necessarily just a broadcast information. But by doing that personally, does that motivate you? By looking at the impacts and recommendations, are you willing to take action? Are you willing to wear a mask today because it might be a problematic day for you with the pollutants you're going to be exposed to? So, this is a journey, and we hope to continue to improve the product and meet more and more of the people's needs.
That's terrific. Thank you. And I will be sure to share those resources in the show notes for our listeners as well. And I would like to say, before I ask you the final question, thank you again for coming on. It's been an honor to hear you talk about this stuff, to answer my questions. Your knowledge and your expertise are truly appreciated. So thanks again. Now on to the final question. Whether you have asthma or not, every breath we take is a gift, a reminder of our resilience, our drive to keep going, and our power to define our own limits. With a single breath, you have the potential to move mountains and change the world. So with that in mind, if you had only one last breath, but with it the power to influence the world, what would your message be?
Our mission at Daily Breath is to help everyone breathe easier, one symptom at a time. Individually and collectively, we can manage the air we breathe and our health, and we can avoid the potential negative impacts that lead to severe health outcomes. And this inspiration came from Emerson's, to know even one life has breathed easier because you have lived. This is to have succeeded.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Wheeze. I'm your host, Josh Rayholm. If today's conversation resonated with you, follow the show and share it with someone who might find it helpful. Guest bios and resources from this episode are available at beyondthewheeze.ca, and additional resources can be found in the show notes. Follow us on LinkedIn, where recap blogs are posted every Friday following new episodes, which are released every second Tuesday. You can also follow me on Instagram at the Asthma Runner. Remember, live with it, not in it. This is Beyond the Wheeze.